you, everybody, and thank you for giving up some of your Saturday afternoons to come and hear this talk. I've drawn you in slightly with Stonehenge, and I am going to talk about Stonehenge quite a lot, but I'm also going to talk about some other key monuments, particularly Mount Pleasant, Silvery Hill, and a little bit on West Kennet Long Barrow. But I'll explain all of those. They're quite famous Neolithic monuments, but I'll give introductions to each of them as we go through. Now, the impetus for this talk, and when I was invited by the Trust to participate in their virtual conference, was to put some of the discoveries at Orton Meadows into context. And so particularly, I thought it would be a good idea to focus on the earliest Bronze Age. And my specialism and my PhD research really focuses on the Neolithic. So what I'm doing here is looking at that transition period between the latest part of the Neolithic and the earliest part of the Bronze Age. Okay. So I thought I'd start with a bit of a timeline so that we kind of know what we're talking about, and we can kind of put all of what I'm saying after this into a bit more context. So here is, imagine this timeline goes off to the left and off to the right. I've just chopped out a key point of it for us to look at today. And this is what we tend to think of as archaeologists as being the period of transition between the latest part of the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, and the earliest part of the Bronze Age. Now, these are the traditional divisions that archaeologists give these periods. Mostly based on the idea that the first metals arrive in Britain and Ireland at the beginning of the Bronze Age. Now, I'll tell you a slightly funny story in that this last week at work, my English Heritage work, I had to comment on a new Minecraft game that had been developed by Highways England. And they had asked for comments from me at English Heritage and also from somebody at the National Trust. And they were laughing in their response to me because they'd said that English Heritage and the National Trust didn't agree on when the Bronze Age started. Now, this is a typical problem for this particular period. And I'm not at all surprised that whoever in the National Trust gave their response also said something slightly different, because this is a bit of a debate, really. In fact, there's a whole volume published by the Prehistoric Society called Is There a British Chalcalithic? And when we say Chalcalithic, what we mean is this bit in the middle here. So we have this transition period between the latest Neolithic and the earliest Bronze Age. Chalcalithic, for those who don't know, is copper. So this is the Copper Age. And certainly on the continent in Europe, you would find a distinct Chalcalithic period and it would be referred to as that. But in Britain, traditionally, we haven't had a copper period because it's just such a short period. You can see it's roughly about 200 years. And what I'd like to explore in this talk is just some of the evidence for what is happening in Britain, particularly southern Britain, and I'm focusing on a particular part of southern Britain, really. But what happens at this transition period, and what is the evidence for what people are doing and how people are moving about and adopting new ideas and practices. So as I'll go through, but this is a sort of a summary to start you off with. In the late Neolithic, we have a period of major monument construction, and we'll be looking at some of those monuments soon. We also don't really know where people are being buried. Burials from this period are very rare. It's possible that most people were being cremated, and it's quite possible that most people were being cremated and put into rivers or the sea, something that means that archaeologists really don't find them very often. So we have a slight issue in that we don't really know what people are doing with their dead at this particular period. And we also don't really know where anyone lives. We do have some settlements from this period. People might be familiar with the famous Scarabray settlement on Orkney, for example. And we do have houses and settlement evidence from some of the major monuments like Durrington Walls, which I'll come on to later. But generally, the evidence is fairly ephemeral. It's pits and flint scatters, and we don't really have a sense of how people were moving about the landscape, whether they were in seasonal settlements, whether they were more permanently settled in some places. So that's a bit of an unknown for us at the moment as well. But we think that the people at this time were largely living by pastoral economy, that they were following their herds of cattle and pigs and sheep, And there's a sense from some of the scientific evidence that people are moving around quite a lot. So they're not necessarily settled in one place. A lot of people think the Neolithic is when everybody settled down into traditional villages, and that's kind of how we've been ever since. But it's certainly not the case for the late Neolithic. Now, in this transition period in the middle, we get new things happening. We get the arrival of new metals, particularly copper and gold initially, and then from about 2200 BC, we have bronze. These metals are being brought over from the continent. So on the continent at this time, people have adopted copper and gold and bronze actually much earlier than in Britain and Ireland. So there's a bit of a time lag between metals being used on the European continent and then being adopted here in Britain. We also have new styles of individual burial, so burial of people with grave goods in either flat graves or underneath small burial mounds. And we have something I can't see because I've got my thing in the way. Whatever I've written there on the screen, I can't see it because my thing keeps popping up and down. So this is a time of new styles of pottery, particularly what's known as beaker pottery, and also probably new arrivals of people in southern Britain, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So then we have the early Bronze Age. People stop building major monuments. There are not huge henges and stone circles. Burials are largely under round mounds, sometimes in flat graves, sometimes under stones, but more often than not under round mounds, although not everybody seems to be buried under barrows. And again, our knowledge about settlement is pretty sparse, it has to be said. We're not really sure where people are living. The evidence still is pits and flint scatters. And so we think that people are living relatively similar lifestyles to what they were in the late Neolithic. But there are some major changes, particularly related to monuments. So this is the period that I'll be talking about in the rest of the talk. So my PhD research is on Neolithic monument complexes, and these purple blobs represent major Neolithic monument complexes. Now, what is a monument complex? It just means a cluster of monuments built in the same place over a relatively long time period of the Neolithic. So these are places that people seem to return to again and again and again throughout the Neolithic period to build monuments and to gather. Now, these are regionally distinctive. The monument complexes in your part of the world, for example, in East Anglia, are often clustered around cursus monuments, early Neolithic rectangular cursus monuments. In Ireland, for example, they are largely passage tomb cemeteries. So there are differences here. I mean, these are the major ones. I could have put hundreds and hundreds of more minor complexes on this map, but for now, I'm just focusing on the more major ones. So to give you some examples, at Dorchester-on-Thames, we have a cursus complex with the big rings henge, which is that crop mark you can see in the black and white photograph, the top left. In the Walton Basin on the Welsh border, we have a huge complex of palisaded enclosures, lots of timber structures, a small set of stone structures, not so well known because ploughed out and not much to see on the ground today, but a major complex. Up in North Yorkshire at Thornborough, we have the Thornborough Henges. We don't actually know the date of these henges, but I assume that they are all late Neolithic. 3 henges and a cursus monument, all in one small location. Up in Scotland, here's an excavations taking place at Forteviot, which is a monument we call a palisaded enclosure, a fenced timber enclosure, which contains a whole series of other monuments, another little complex. Up on Orkney, famously, of course, the Stenes Brodgar complex, where we've got famous stone circles, henge monuments and settlements. And at Newgrange, in the Bend of the Boyne, we have the amazing passage tombs of Newgrange, but a whole cluster of lots of different monuments there, passage tombs, a cursus probably, lots of round barrows, enclosures and henges, all in one small place. Now, these monument complexes develop over the Neolithic period. Many of them have early Neolithic elements to them. Some of them have middle Neolithic activity, and almost all of them have quite intensive late Neolithic activity. Those major monuments are getting built really between 3000 BC and 2500 BC at the end of the Neolithic. And many of them continue to be complexes on into the Bronze Age. So these are places where many, many round barrows are built. Now, I'm going to focus today on some complexes that are down here in southern England. And I should say that this is a very, very regional story. Don't take what I say as read for the entirety of Britain and Ireland, because there are regional differences. And there are some areas, you can already see some of them on this map, where we don't get large monuments being built. So it's not the story for everywhere. Down in near me, near Bristol, we have this is just this cluster of what I would refer to as complexes: the stone circles and avenues and cove at Stanton Drew. We have the Henge circles at Priddy, which is now accompanied by an enclosure and a whole load of other things, that including a timber circle that Jodie Lewis has been recently excavating down on the Mendips. We have the cluster of monuments surrounding the Dorset cursus, the longest cursus monument that we know of so far. Lots of late Neolithic and middle Neolithic monuments clustered around the central section of that cursus. And of course, some more famous ones: Avebury, with its famous henge and stone circles, but also a whole cluster of other monuments, including Silvery Hill, that we'll mention a bit later. Marden, which is down in the Vale of Pewsey, halfway between Avebury and Stonehenge, huge henge enclosure, lots of other associated monuments, and of course the famous complexes at Stonehenge and at Dorchester, down on the south coast in Dorset. Now I'm going to focus first a bit on Dorchester, and the reason for looking at Dorchester rather than Stonehenge is because this has been the focus of my PhD research over the last few years. This is a map of the Dorchester Complex. If you know Dorchester at all, the town itself is roughly here. It's a Roman town and a bustling medieval and modern town, and it covers up much of this. And there's not that much to see on the ground for people visiting the town today, but it was the site of a major Neolithic monument complex. My work initially has been focused on this monument here, called Mount Pleasant. And you can see that all the monuments sit within this triangular shaped piece of land between the rivers South Winterbourne and the rivers Froome, which both flow. They're at the confluence just to the east of this map, and then they flow out into the south coast, not far away. So I'm going to be talking a bit about this particular henge monument. This is Mount Pleasant Henge, because it's a good place to talk about this Neolithic Bronze Age transition. The monument of Mount Pleasant Henge looks like this. It's a henge. It's what we call a mega henge, one of these really large henges. It has an outer bank and a ditch surrounding it. And within that is a palisade, so a fenced palisade made up of timber posts. And in the centre of the site is what's known rather romantically as Site 4, which is a concentric timber monument surrounded by its own ditch. There are a few other features there. You can see that there was a barrow, a round barrow called the Concave Barrow, which was built, we think, on top of the henge bank at a slightly later date. And some sort of feature that's been identified by aerial survey, which it seems to be some sort of roadway or approach, which seems to link this monument to the nearby river, where there's a fording point of the River Froome. The site was excavated in 1970 and 1971 by Jeff Wainwright. And that's the only major excavations that have taken place at this site. Here are Jeff's excavations. This is an aerial view of the excavations taking place at Site 4, that concentric timber monument with its own ditch. You can see that they were camping on site and their mess tent. And I quite like this photograph because it's a nice colour image with some nice cars in it of 1970s excavations in full flow. Now, this monument, Site 4, is quite complicated. It's got this series of concentric timber post rings surrounding a sort of square setting of sarsen stones and post holes, which you might describe as a cove or some sort of central setting. Many other similar monuments have this type of square setting at the centre of it. And there are some more sarsens scattered around the outside of the monument. And then it's surrounded by a ditch. Ignore the slightly complicated looking references around the edge. Basically, they are where we took the samples from for radiocarbon dating as part of the project. But it's quite a complicated monument, and I'll talk about this monument particularly because this is where we think there's some interesting things going on right at the end of the late Neolithic. Now, in the ditch here, when the excavators looked at it in detail, they found a layer of burning and a layer of broken and burnt sarsen chips And this was about halfway up the filling of the ditch. And it was interpreted by Jeff Wainwright, who led the excavations, as the evidence for when they'd worked and shaped the stones and put them upright as part of the monument, so a construction layer. But later on, Josh Pollard and other archaeologists have reinterpreted that layer and have suggested that actually it's to do with the destruction of this site, a destruction that took place when the ditch was half filled, and that people were breaking up the sarcens that formed part of this monument and burning them, or burning something anyway in the ditch. That's a nice aerial view. Well, it's not that nice actually. It's a poor slide. I'm sorry. There's not that many good photographs of Mount Pleasant. It's a slightly tricky site to take good photographs of. This is an aerial photograph taken in 1996, and you can see that it shows in the crop marks there very clearly the different elements that I've been talking about. So down here you have this outer bank, which shows up as this white spread where the bank is being eroded by the plough, and within that you can see the ditch of the henge around like that, and you can see the line of the palisade as well as this faint line, and also goes out through the entrance here. This is another entrance which looks to either be blocked by later posts or pits, or potentially there's a ring of pits that then is kind of embellished to make a ditch. This is a new entrance, was only discovered quite recently. Well, it was discovered because of the analysis of these aerial photographs by Martin Barber. And here's the Site 4 ditch in the middle. Just trying to ignore the sewage farm in the background. It's quite sad actually, because this is a really important site, and I suspect that there is evidence for settlement here. There's a huge amount of animal bone was excavated by Jeff in the 70s, and we would now expect, because of the excavations that have taken place at the very similar site of Durrington Walls near Stonehenge, where some houses and some intensive occupation evidence has been discovered, it may well be that Mount Pleasant was also a place where there was a settlement and a huge amount of intensive occupation. But unfortunately, we don't have the evidence for that at the moment, and the site remains under the plough. So that evidence is slowly disappearing over time, sadly. Now, the project that I've been doing as part of my PhD is to do some new radiocarbon dating of this particular monument and all of the different components of that monument. So we've been going into the archive at Dorset County Museum and selecting samples of antler picks, of human bone, of charcoal, and radiocarbon dating them and analysing them. This is Dr. Pete Marshall, who's been helping me with this project, and this is the kind of object that we've been sampling. This is an antler pick, probably familiar sort of thing that you might see from any prehistoric site, but these are crucial to us for radiocarbon dating, because a worn antler pick like this one, deposited in the very bottom of a ditch, is highly likely to have come from the actual digging of that ditch. And so by radiocarbon dating it, and by radiocarbon dating many of them, we can get a fairly precise estimate of exactly when that ditch was dug. Okay, so this is, don't get scared by the fact it's a graph and it's complicated, but this is a summary of what we discovered through that process. Now, we dated material from the Henge ditch and bank itself, one date from the Concave Barrow ditch, which was that barrow built on the side, lots of dates from the timber palisade, and lots of dates from the Site 4 ditch. Unfortunately, there was no material available to date from Site 4, the timber circuit itself, but we've got the ditch. Now, what this graph shows you, I hope you can see my mouse, is the probability of when that element of the site was built. So this green part of the graph, for example, is when we think the Henge enclosure itself was constructed. So you can see it's in roughly 2,550, something like that. But obviously, because of all these processes, you come up with a mathematical probability. That's where we think the best guess is for when that monument was built. So the first thing that happened on the site was the Henge bank and ditch all the way around the outside, that enormous mega henge. Then the second thing probably is this pink blob, which represents that construction of that Concave Barrow, that round barrow on the Henge ditch, on Henge bank, sorry. Then we've got quite a lot of exciting activity all happening at once. We've got this blue, which is the palisade itself, the timber palisade being built, and roughly at the same time, of maybe slightly shortly afterwards, we've got the Site 4 ditch being dug. And from comparison with other concentric timber monuments, like, for example, Woodhenge, usually those ditches are dug around such monuments after they've been constructed. So it may well be that Site 4 itself is the same date as some of these other elements. So that's just a way of representing through time what happened and what date at Mount Pleasant. Now you can see that the overall period is not that long. We're talking about roughly 125 years, something like that, for all of these elements of the sites we built. So they're constructing this major monument and then modifying it very quickly afterwards. And you can see there we've added the generations at the top. So this is a generation of gap of 25 years. So, for example, it may have been the grandchildren of the people who built the initial Henge monument who decided to erect the palisade. So we're talking about a couple of generations, 2-3 generations of time, certainly within living memory, really short period of time for these major elements to be constructed. So this is another way of showing that same information, which is just showing you how that monument developed over time. So the first part to be built was probably the bank and ditch of the Henge. The second part, you've got them coming in as kind of slightly faint here, but getting bolder. So this is probably where both the Concave Barrow and the palisade get built. And then later on, you've got the Site 4 ditch coming in. So that's Mount Pleasant Henge. So we've looked at this monument here in quite a lot of detail, and it's being built in that 2500 BC period, which is just right at the end of that late Neolithic period, if you think back to that timeline I showed at the beginning. But the Dorchester Complex has got loads of other stuff in it as well. I'll just run through quickly what the chronology is of this. I've coloured in the monuments in different colours to show you what period they fall into, and the stars are evidence for settlement. So evidence like pits and flint scatters where people look to have been occupying the landscape. So in the early Neolithic, the purple stuff, we've got very famously Maiden Castle. Most people will know Maiden Castle is a very famous Iron Age hill fort, but underneath the hill fort and at this end of it is an early Neolithic causewayed enclosure. And over the top of that is constructed a very long bank barrow, which is that line that you can see cutting across it. And this is built right back in the early Neolithic period, 3600 BC. So it's one of the first things to happen in this landscape. We've also got a number of long barrows, and we've got one funny long barrow here, which is actually not dissimilar in some ways to some of your Orton Meadows evidence, which is two long parallel ditches, 75 metres in length, possibly a long barrow, possibly a sort of short cursus or a long enclosure of some kind. There were no burials and there was no sign of an internal bank or mound. But again, this is roughly around 3500 BC that is being constructed. We've got a cattle skull from one of the ditches, which has provided a very good date for us. Moving into the Middle Neolithic, so this is roughly around 3200, 3000 BC, we see a lot less activity. We've got one bit of occupation and we have one monument, this one, which is called Flagstones. This is the Flagstones Enclosure. You can see it, it's not a very good photograph, I apologise, but this is it during excavation when the Dorchester bypass was constructed. And it's a perfectly circular ring of segmented pits. And this is what we call a proto-henge or a formative henge. It's an early type of henge monument. And this particular monument was used for the burial of a number of adult and children, child inhumations and adult cremations. And again, our dating is showing that this is around about 3200 BC that it's being constructed. Now, what you have at the end is a kind of a frenzy of building activity. You have an explosion of late Neolithic activity all happening around about 2500 BC. So you've got Mount Pleasant that we've talked about, but we've also got Monbry Rings, which is a fantastic large henge monument. Inside this monument was a ring of 45 incredibly deep shafts, which were dug down 7 or 8 metres down into the chalk, and lots of random things put in there, antler picks and animal bones and human bones and all kinds of things. Very strange monument, but it's still a very large and upstanding and impressive earthwork. And here we have what we call the Greyhound Yard enclosure, which is another huge timber palisaded, probably circular enclosure, although we've only got bits of it. This photograph shows you the bit of it that was excavated when they were building the shopping centre in the middle of Dorchester. So if you go to the Waitrose in the middle of Dorchester, you will find some markers on the floor of the car park which show you where these posts once stood. And again, this was built around about 2500 BC. And you've got Mount Pleasant, which we've already talked about. So you can see that this monument complex it's reused over a long period of time. There are early Neolithic, middle Neolithic, and late Neolithic components, but it's not continuous building and occupation. It's quite punctuated, it's quite episodic. Really, we've got some big gaps. There's about 600 or 700 years between when they build that Flagstones circular enclosure and when they start all the other monuments. So there's large periods of the Neolithic when really nothing is being built here. So part of my work has been trying to build those reasonably accurate chronologies so that we can look at what's happening in this landscape. Now, the crucial bit comes with the transition to the early Bronze Age. I'm showing you that graph again. It's the same information as before. Here are the bits of Mount Pleasant that are being built: the Henge, the Concave Barrow, the Palisade, and Site 4 Ditch. But what we've added to this version of the graph is this pink, purpley peak. This is the estimate for when beaker burials start in southern England. So this is a whole load of radiocarbon dates that have been obtained from skeletons that have been buried with beaker pottery across southern England, and it gives you a really good estimate for when all of that activity starts. So when people start to be buried with beaker pots in individual graves, in both flat graves and in mounds. And you can see that that activity happens pretty hot on the heels of when people are doing things at Mount Pleasant, but a bit later, perhaps 100 years later. And this grey bit here is the destruction bit of that Site 4 ditch. I don't know if you remember, but back a few minutes ago, I was talking about the fact that in that ditch around Site 4, there's this layer of burnt sarsen and burning, which looks to have been to the destruction, perhaps, or the dismantling of the sarsen aspects of that particular monument. And you can see that that's happening. It's not a very good estimate, but it's quite a lot later. So at some point later on, really, we're into the Bronze Age now, that monument is being dismantled and destroyed, which is a really interesting episode of activity. And moving on slightly into the early Bronze Age, what we get in the Dorchester complex are the building of some large round barrows, which we tend to get referred to as aggrandized round barrows. I've marked them here. I hope you can see in orange. There's a whole kind of arc of them here. And quite a number of them, particularly here, these ones were excavated when a school was built, the Thomas Hardy School in the middle of Dorchester. They're very early beaker burials. And they're large barrows. This is an example of one. This is the Clandom Barrow, which is number 1 here. These are prominent, enormous round barrows. These are not small things. So it seems that the Neolithic complex at Dorchester was deliberately selected for the burial of both early beaker burials and then also for these large early Bronze Age barrows. The Clandom Barrow may be ringing faint bells for some people. This is the Clandom Barrow burial goods. Absolutely extraordinary collection of gold and amber and jet items that were excavated from the Clandom Barrow. So these are particularly important burials. And interestingly, they seem to be they highlight this kind of ridge that runs across the area. And they do appear to be built in relation to these earlier monuments. Now, I have added 5 there, which is the Concave Barrow. I have to confess, this map I drew before we had the dates back for Concave Barrow. Concave Barrow does seem to be earlier than that. It's a late Neolithic, and it's probably not a burial. It may not be a burial mound at all. It may be a sort of viewing platform or something to do with the construction of the palisade at Mount Pleasant. But certainly this is a focus for early beaker burials. And if you think Dorchester's not that far from the south coast, are people coming across from the continent? And one of the first places you might get to that was important potentially is the Dorchester area. Just going to take a sip of water. Okay. Right, I'm going to move on to Stonehenge now. Hope you can keep all of Mount Pleasant in your head. So Stonehenge, I don't really need to introduce it, do I? The key thing to think about here is that Stonehenge is not a monument that was all built in one go. The monument that you can see today is the result of several phases of building, of embellishment, of modification, change over a long, long period. The first part of Stonehenge to be built is the outer henge ditch, the outer bank and ditch of the henge. So this is a very, very similar monument to that Flagstones monument that I was just discussing. It's another proto-henge or formative henge, an early type of henge. And in this first phase, around about 3000 BC, there were some standing stones or posts in what we call the Aubrey holes. We call them the Aubrey holes because they're named after John Aubrey, the antiquarian who first mapped them. There's some debate amongst archaeologists as to whether there were stone pillars here or whether they were timber posts, or actually whether they were just freestanding pits, which may well be the case. I mean, not freestanding, I mean kind of empty pits dug as a pit circle rather than for holding uprights. If you ask Mike Parker Pearson, or if you read any of his books, he will say that this is where the bluestones stood when they were first brought to the site, but I'm not 100% convinced by that. I think the jury's out a little bit. So this is the first Stonehenge, and this is used as a cremation cemetery for around about the first 300, 400 years, from about 3000 BC onwards. We think about 150 people were buried at the site. So in a similar way to the Flagstones monument I was just talking about, this is a burial monument. It's at least one of its purposes. If we jump forward 500 years to 2500 BC, that's when the Stonehenge monument arrives that we know and think of and love today. This is when the Sarsen stones get brought to the site from the Marlborough Downs, more specifically from, we think now, the area called West Woods, which is just south of Marlborough town itself. And they're put up in the familiar shapes of the Sarsen circle and the Sarsen horseshoe inside. And at this stage, the bluestones are also brought to the site from the Preseli Hills in southwest Wales and are set up in a double arc. Not very easy to see on this image, I realise, but a double arc of small bluestones are set up just here on this side of the monument. And then a few hundred years later, 2200 BC, something like that, the bluestones get rearranged. So these smaller stones within the larger setting get repositioned, removed from that double arc and replaced in an inner horseshoe and an outer circle. So there's some modification going on, and we don't really know why people decided to start moving bluestones around a few hundred years later, but they did. So there's a multiple phase, and this is very much, I've taken some snapshots here. This is not necessarily the only changes that took place in the monument. It's like taking 3 photographs at 3 different dates in the monument's history. There was probably a lot more change in between. So here's just a view, just in case you're not familiar. Here's one of the bluestones. The bluestones are these much smaller pillar-like stones that you can see in and amongst the much larger Sarsen stones. We tend to call them the smaller stones, although if you go and stand next to one, it is much taller than a person. They are quite hefty things. They're still a major feat to have been brought from southwest Wales. Now, the crucial thing about Stonehenge is that it's built again at that 2500 BC date, which is right at the end of the late Neolithic period. And the rearrangement of those bluestones takes place a few hundred years later. So in that transition period, in that Chalcalithic or early Bronze Age period. So this is a monument that people return to throughout that period of transition. Now, Stonehenge doesn't sit by itself. It is also part of a major monument complex. Note here, just in passing, the number of brown spots. Those are all round barrows of the early Bronze Age, which cluster particularly on the ridges around Stonehenge. But what I want to just mention is that at Darrington Walls, a huge henge monument and a very similar monument to Mount Pleasant, excavations have uncovered evidence. This is Mike Parker Pearson's Stonehenge Riverside project, have uncovered evidence for a major settlement. This major settlement, which we've reconstructed here, which is a place of gathering, a place of feasting, a place where large numbers of people seem to have come together and eaten a lot of meat, and used a lot of pots, and lit a lot of fires, had a jolly time. But in amongst them, there are also some timber structures. This is the southern circle, and up here you've got the northern circle. These are timber structures, not unlike the Site 4 that we were just talking about at Mount Pleasant. So this is not necessarily an ordinary settlement. This is a place where people were probably gathering on a seasonal basis to take part in the building of Stonehenge, and or perhaps the ceremonies and rituals that were taking place at these timber structures and at Stonehenge nearby. The radiocarbon dates from this site also land just on that 2500 BC period. So we think that people are living here just at the time that the Sarsen stones are being erected at Stonehenge and the blue stones are being moved from the Preselles. You might be able to note that there's a sort of roadway here leading between the river, this is the River Avon, and the Southern Circle. This is one of the discoveries of Mike's excavations. And what he found when he excavated here was actually these houses were preserved underneath the banks of the later Henge. The Henge earthwork, the bank and the ditch, had been constructed on top of the remains of these houses. So there was a settlement here, there were the timber structures, and then there's a sort of closing, a sort of as Kenny Brophy would probably refer to it, a henging, an enclosing of this space, monumentalising it, and perhaps that was the end of its use as a gathering place. But moving back to the main complex, what I want to look at now briefly is, it's off my map generally because there isn't that many monuments there, although there probably are a few more I should add. But in the very earliest part of that Chalcolithic early Bronze Age period, we get the very earliest beaker burials in the Stonehenge landscape. They're not buried right here at Stonehenge. They're not buried even in this immediate area. They're buried on the other side of the river here in areas near Amesbury town. And many of these have been discovered in the last 20 years or so through developer archaeology. And I'll just focus on one of them I'm sure is already familiar to you. This is the Amesbury Archer, excavated in 2001 by Wessex Archaeology. And he was found buried in a flat grave just to the south of Amesbury. And I think I have to apologise for the poor quality excavation photograph here. Amesbury Archer was discovered on a Friday afternoon of a bank holiday weekend, and the excavators decided that because they found some metal that they couldn't risk leaving this over the weekend, so they actually excavated into the night, which is why you have such terrible photographs of the excavation, because they're floodlit, they're not actually daylight. So they were working under interesting conditions. Anyway, here's the burial. Several beaker pots. I think there were 7 beaker pots that were buried with this man. He had a number of items with him that look like metalworking tools, some flint tools. He had a wrist guard attached to his arm, and there was another wrist guard also in the grave. And there were some gold earrings or hair tresses, which I'm not sure if he's wearing in that picture. Doesn't seem to, perhaps he's wearing them in his hair, I don't know. Anyway, they were found down here where it says earrings. So this is one of the earliest beaker burials we have from southern England, and he's with some of the earliest metal. He's that gold, those earrings are some of the very earliest gold that are known from Britain. So he's really important, but he's near Stonehenge. You know, there's Stonehenge, look in the background, but he's not being buried right next to the monument. He's at some remove, some distance from the core of activity. And we know, of course, that from what I've just said, that the blue stones were being rearranged perhaps even after he had died. So the monument is still an active place where people are doing things when he's here. Now, the famous thing about the Amesbury Archer was that his isotopes were looked at, and I believe that later in your lecture series you've got Ian Armitt coming to talk to you about isotopes and DNA in a bit more detail. So I won't go into too much about the detail of how isotopes work and how archaeologists use them. But in short, they showed that he had been living as a child in continental Europe, probably somewhere in the Alps. And so he's somebody that has arrived in Britain at the very earliest part of the beaker period. If you were in old-fashioned days, you would say he's one of the beaker folk. Now, that's probably not the way we would talk about it today, but he's certainly somebody coming across with new metals, new style of pottery, his companions are burying him in a new style of individual grave. So he's part of this major change that happens around this time. Just put there the radiocarbon dates for his the date that he died. So you can see 2380 to 2290 Cal BC. So this is just around the time, just before perhaps those blue stones are being rearranged at Stonehenge. Now finally, before I start to draw this together, I just look at one more monument. This is Silvery Hill, the largest prehistoric mound known in Europe. Just located outside of Avebury. I'm sure many of you have visited Avebury at some point in the past. And a monument that is part of the Avebury complex, but a very complicated monument. It's been excavated a few different times, but it's not just, again, one monument. Like Stonehenge, it was built and rebuilt and modified over a number of different occasions. And this is a cross-section through the mound. You can see that there are kind of early mounds built of organic layers. There's actually lots more mounds in this that I haven't shown, but there are a number of ditches that get dug and refilled in and moving outwards each time until you get this enormous outer ditch for the final phase of the monument. It's quite a complicated history, and we only know about this because of tunnels that have been dug in through to the centre. So we only have a slightly kind of restricted view of what's going on inside the hill. But I've put on there again some radiocarbon dates for the most recent excavations at the site, which show that this little mound in the middle here, this organic mound, which was built of layers of gravel and turfs and soil, was built 2450 to 2410. So that's before our friend Amesbury Archer arrives. But the completion of this enormous chalk mound is quite a lot later. It's running into what we might call the early Bronze Age. So this is round about the time that Amesbury Archer was alive. So, you know, if he happened to walk 20 miles north, he may have seen the Silvery Hill being constructed, which is quite an intriguing thought. And here we've got a reconstruction, quite a newly commissioned reconstruction that we've done for some new graphic panels at Silvery Hill, showing people building that enormous mound, digging the ditch out of this enormous basin-like ditch that was dug next to Silvery Hill, and then carting the chalk up, making the mound itself. So these are kind of major monument construction. This is not just something you do on the weekend for fun. This is enormous logistical projects like Stonehenge, like Mount Pleasant, like Silvery Hill, where people are working together to achieve really extraordinary things that we would struggle to do, I'm sure, today, with, you know, the most basic technology, really, in terms of basketry and antler picks and timber. So, you know, you're not talking about anything using metals here. Finally, just want to touch on West Kennet Long Barrow, which is not far, just above Silvery Hill. In fact, you might just be able to see Silvery Hill just in the distance there. It's a bit of a gloomy day when I took this picture. West Kennet's a much earlier monument. It's an early Neolithic monument. It's the same date as those early barrows you've got at Orton Meadows. Very famous site, very reconstructed and excavated in the 1960s. And this monument here is really important for understanding about that early Bronze Age transition, because although this is an early Neolithic monument, that's when it's built, that's when it's used for the burial of the dead. We think about 36 people were buried in the chambers of this tomb. For the next over 1,000 years, people returned to this barrow again and again and again to deposit all kinds of things within the chambers. Human burials, animal burials, pots, all kinds of sort of debris, midden-like stuff, ash, soils. And the very final deposits in these chambers were some beakers. So people right through until the earliest Bronze Age, when the beakers pottery is around, are frequenting and visiting this particular site. This is a new graphic panel that we've just done for this site. It's not actually been installed. You're getting a sneak preview. But it shows, I hope you can see at the bottom of the screen there, two lovely beaker pots, which were some of the latest objects to be put into the chambers in that earliest Bronze Age period. So it's a really long time period that people are coming back to these monuments. And that continues into the period when people are using beaker pottery. Okay, so right, I'm going to try and bring all this together now. So here's back to our timeline. Here's the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age and this transition period in between. So we've got, in the late Neolithic period here, we've got Stonehenge being built, the Sarsens being put up. We've got occupation and activity happening at Durrington Walls nearby. We've got monuments like Mount Pleasant Henge being constructed. We've basically got a monument, what I would call a monument frenzy. And this is the case for certainly the Wessex area of southern England, and further afield, I think, as well. I think there is a huge number of palisaded enclosures and henge enclosures being built around that 2500 BC date. Not necessarily everywhere, but certainly in various parts, that is a key date, and there is a lot of activity going on in a lot of different places. So we've got this monument frenzy in the late Neolithic. We've got other monuments that seem to be built a little bit later. So Monbry Rings, that henge that I showed you near Mount Pleasant in the Dorchester Complex, is dated. The dates there come out somewhere around about 2400 BC, so a little bit later. And Silvery Hill's the same. It's also that little bit later, seems to be edging into this transition period. But at the same time, we've got those first earliest beaker burials. We've got Danesbury Archer. We've generally got early beaker burials, so those ones I mentioned in the middle of Dorchester at Thomas Hardy School are very early as well. And we've got the first copper and gold being deposited with those burials. So here's some nice beaker pots. These are all the beaker pots that were buried with Danesbury Archer. So we've got all that happening at the same time. And then we've got things like the destruction layer at Site 4, that time when they may be taking down a monument as part of the Mount Pleasant complex. You've got rearrangement of things happening. You've got people returning to monuments to do things. So they're moving the blue stones at Stonehenge around. And there is a huge amount of evidence from after about 2200 BC of people returning to major Neolithic monuments and not necessarily modifying them, but certainly there's lots of beaker pottery turns up in the ditches and in the post holes in various places around these monuments. So people are returning to these older monuments, but they're obviously using this new fangled beaker pottery at the time. So there's this return to older monuments. So this is, I find this period absolutely fascinating, what's happening around this time. And if you were being taught at university, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, this would be the time of the beaker folk. These are the beaker folk. They've arrived with their beakers and the first gold. Everything changes. And from then on, we've got a whole different ballgame. In the intervening period, so when I was at university in the early 2000s, that was very much old-fashioned view. You did not talk about the beaker folk. These were practices that were being adopted by the native people living in Britain. These happened to be adopting new styles of pottery and new styles of metal, but not necessarily any migration of people. Now, there's been a big change recently, which is that we have got new evidence to add into this mix. And that's the fact that we've got ancient DNA from some of these burials. And in combination with some of the evidence from the isotopes, we can say that there definitely are people arriving in Britain from the continent in this time period. Now, sorry for the poor quality of these slides, but this is not my work at all, but there's been a really exciting new paper just published by Tom Booth and Joe Brooke, and I'm sure in the later lecture she's going to give you in a few weeks' time, she may well mention this work that she's been doing. Ancient DNA is one of those things that is the very exciting side of archaeology at the moment. It's quite tricky to understand, and it's full of interesting debates. But this latest paper by them, which they looked at some of the evidence from DNA papers and got some extraordinary results, particularly from the Stonehenge area. Now, this funny blue and red chart here shows, in effect, blue is British Neolithic DNA. So this is all the burials that they've sampled from throughout the Neolithic period, and this shows them being indigenous, I guess, not indigenous back beyond that because they're obviously arriving in the Neolithic, but they're pretty similar native DNA. And the red is a continental type of steppe ancestry DNA, something that comes across with people at that early Bronze Age transition. And it's a pretty wholesale scale change. When this was first published, people talked about genocide, wiping out the native population almost entirely. But you may notice that we've got a bit of an issue here, in that there's not many burials from this final late Neolithic stage. And in fact, we've got a gap. And that's because, as I said at the beginning, we don't have that many burials from this latest Neolithic period to test. We don't have that many burials that the DNA has been extracted from. And what Joe and Tom in this latest paper have really looked at is the idea that actually what we're seeing here is difference in burial. So what you get from this period onwards are those individual burials, like the Amesbury Archer. And many of those people do have DNA that comes from the continent. They are part of an incoming population. But what happens is that because the late Neolithic people probably carry on for quite some time, not doing useful things from an archaeological point of view with their dead, sticking them in rivers or whatever they're doing with them, we don't see them, and we can't see them in the record. So there's a huge transition, but it's not necessarily a total transition of population. And what Tom and Joe have recently shown is that quite a number of the burials buried in and around the Stonehenge area, sorry, this is a terrible map, just trust me, they're from the Stonehenge area, are related to each other. So these are people who are uncles and aunts, nephews and nieces, cousins. They a huge number, considering that not many of them have been sampled or excavated, a huge number of the people buried under the earliest round barrows and those early beaker burials are related to each other. So that suggests and what Tom and Joe conclude is that the first people who come across to southern England from the continent in that Chalcalithic period are pretty much staying as a group. They are intermarrying amongst themselves. They're not intermixing with the native Neolithic population. And for a couple of generations, they are basically intermarrying amongst themselves and staying separate from the local people, which is really fascinating. I mean, this is amazing things that ancient DNA can now do for us. So I'll just flip back just to that timeline again. So what we've got is a population of people who are arriving and living, at least in the Stonehenge area, separately to the people who were already there. And then what Joe and Tom have shown is that from about this date onwards, there's much more intermixing. So from about 2200 BC, people who are Neolithic people and people who are incoming from the continent begin to intermarry and intermix much more. And that's when we get this return. That's when we get people coming back to monuments and using their beaker pottery, because these are the monuments that their, fairly immediate ancestors have built. So that's why you get this kind of return to monuments like the West Kennet Long Barrow and like Durrington Walls and Stonehenge, for example. So we're beginning now to pick out, oh, sorry, I shouldn't have shown all that at once. That wasn't supposed to be. We're beginning to pick out the detail of this really interesting transition period, and new scientific techniques like ancient DNA and isotopes and precise radiocarbon dating are helping us to kind of disentangle and really get to the nitty-gritty of what this transition looks like in reality. Now, there's two interpretations which I want to finish with, you'll be glad to hear, which is, sorry, I meant to show these in nice order, but they all come at once, so you'll just have to read them. Why on earth do we get this big building frenzy around about 2500 BC? What is it that makes everybody build these spectacular and frankly backbreaking and enormously time-consuming monuments? So there's two ways, I think, of looking at this, and there are probably other ways, but these are my two kind of ways of thinking about this. Number one is that you get something which means that the arrival of new people from the continent is on the horizon. There's change coming. Remember that those burials are obviously when people die and get buried, so presumably people are coming over a little bit before that. And there's something of a threat about this fact. And somehow it causes people to kind of knuckle down and build even bigger and even better and even more impressive. To kind of, it's almost like, look busy, lads. We're doing, this is what we're doing. This is what we believe in. This is what we think will kind of counter this threat. And so that it's causal. So that this arrival of new people creates this big frenzy of monument construction. The other way, the flip side, the other way of looking at that is that there is an increasing amount of building activity and monumental construction at the end of the late Neolithic, perhaps because of kind of competition between different communities, or perhaps because some sort of religious fervour. There's all kinds of ways you can think about why people might have been building them. But basically, this causes a bit of a problem, and that there's a sort of collapse. So people suddenly think, actually, do you know what? I'm not going to be bothered building these monuments anymore. I really can't be bothered. I'm going to go and take my family and live a life of ease somewhere else. So you might get resistance or rebellion, or some sort of collapse of authority or beliefs, perhaps something that causes this to be an unsustainable way of living, that there's so much energy going into this monument construction that it kind of everything collapses. And that collapse creates a vacuum into which there's a kind of power vacuum into which new people and objects and ideas and beliefs can finally arrive, because remember, they've been on the continent for quite some time before they get to Britain. So I don't know if that any of those are the right answers, or any of those may well be somewhere near the truth. But isn't it just a fascinating period? I find it very interesting to think about these different communities of people and the travelling and the movement around and the building of all these monuments and new people arriving. So I think it's a really fascinating period of prehistory, and I think it's one where we'll learn a lot more about over the coming few years as all of those new techniques are used to their full extent. Oh, see, it did go. So there we go. Thank you very much for listening. I'll stop sharing my screen and we can...
Well,
still here, that's good.
What a lot to think about. As a poor Romanist who's used to dealing in time slices of 25 years, I'm very struck by the fact the period that Susan's talked about is the whole of the Roman contact with Britain, from sort of 50 or so BC right the way through to their final departing as an organized authority. And I'm used to dealing in little time slices, and Susan has the problem of dealing with it in great big lumps of time. But it is a fascinating time, and it is interesting that we see these monuments being used and reused again. And the endurance, I think, of sort of practice on folk memory is interesting in all this, that people are drawn back to these sites time and time again. Now, if anyone would like to ask Susan questions, you can do it through chat. David and Rex, who are our two administrative people in charge, will try and sift these questions so that we don't get the same question turning up time and time again. I don't know if anyone's got one which we can lead off with. David, is there something on the board?
There's just one very quick question so far. On the introduction map, a site was shown on the River Trent. Is this Aston?
Yes, it is. I think it is. To be fair, I'd have to go back and double check that it definitely is, but it sounds familiar, and certainly it's one of the complexes I've been putting in that more major category.
There's another question that's come in now regarding the influx of new people. You need to consider why a large number of people are suddenly arriving from Europe. You don't like the idea of conquest, but what about trade? What could the indigenous population give them?
Oh, yeah, good question. So yes, I mean it is a large number, but it's not like huge numbers of people. It's probably, it's difficult to put a number on it, but more like hundreds rather than thousands, I would definitely say. So why would they want to come across? Yes, one point is metal sources. So the British Isles is very rich in resources like tin from Cornwall and gold, particularly from Cornwall and Wales and Ireland. And it may well have been, in fact, some people have suggested that these were metal prospectors. They were coming across to look for new sources of metal ores that would be useful for making their copper and their eventually their bronze. So that is one potential reason why people would want to come across. The other idea is perhaps that people travel from the continent because these major monument building programs are taking place, and they're famous in effect, that people are traveling to visit them, and they're heard about and known about, and you would maybe want to go and have a look. But yeah, it's what's interesting is that they don't arrive before. I think that's what the funny thing is, that there's this definite gap between people using these metals and living these kind of lifestyles using beaker pottery on the continent, but there's quite a gap before they do arrive in the British Isles. So metal and the drive for metal may well have been one of them. Other people have suggested that there's population density and if it was, if you were looking for new land, and you might just be kind of setting off and finding new places to live, but populations are not that much in this period. It's quite hard to imagine that it was so full that people were leaving because of that reason.
Thanks, Susan. Another question: do you think that intervisibility between sites was important in the landscape around Stonehenge?
Yes, certainly. In the early Bronze Age, I mentioned that the round barrows are particularly built along ridges that overlook Stonehenge. It seems to have been very important in the early Bronze Age to be buried within sight of Stonehenge, the monument, even though by that stage it was several hundred years old. Intervisibility in before that, it's difficult to know for sure. It's a fairly open landscape. That's one of the reasons why the monuments may well be built in that area to start with, in that it's unusually open for southern England at the beginning of the Neolithic, and so it's an eminently easy place to build large monuments and to gather in large numbers and to observe the sky. And of course, I didn't mention it at all today, but we all know that Stonehenge is aligned with the solstices and the movements of the sun. So observing things in terms of what's in the sky may also have been important. But yeah, visibility is one of those things that is sometimes more important than others. And I think certainly in the early Bronze Age, it's something that people are very much aware of.
Right. There are a few very general questions coming in that I'll leave to the end if we've got time, but some slightly more specific ones. Is there any evidence for a population decline prior to the arrivals of new populations, or a decline in agriculture?
No, there isn't. There is an interesting change that happens between the early Neolithic and, say, the middle Neolithic, which is when people seem to change from growing quite a lot of cereals to a mainly pastoral economy. And that's interesting because it seems that cereals in the first part of the early Neolithic are very popular, and everybody's happily growing their wheat and their barley, but there's something happens, whether it's disease in the crops, whether it's particular kind of climate changes that happen. There's a kind of move away from crops at that time. But the late Neolithic, there isn't any evidence of population decline. But that doesn't mean to say there wasn't any. The reason we don't know that is because we just don't have those burials. So it's very difficult for us to estimate numbers of people, populations, and to be able to see any change in that. So yeah, it's a good idea, but we just don't have the evidence for it.
Continuing the theme of populations, how does the DNA evidence from the transition period reflects the rest of Britain? Is the Stonehenge landscape indicative? Does it follow a similar pattern to the rest of the country?
Yes, in short it does. So we get very early beaker burials in areas like Dorchester and Stonehenge, but we also get very early beaker burials in places like the Western Isles, for example, and parts of Scotland. So there seem to be slightly different areas of the continent that people are coming from, and also different areas of Britain and Ireland where people land up and end up living. But there are pockets where those early beaker burials don't seem to appear. So, for example, the Avebury Monument Complex seems to continue on in terms of building monuments like Silvery Hill a bit later, and you don't get any of those early beaker burials don't seem to be existing in that landscape. So it suggests that it's quite patchy, and that there are particular places in southern Britain, at least, where those early beaker people do turn up and start living and intermarrying amongst themselves and burying themselves, but not everywhere. So yeah, I think that's probably the best answer I can give without getting into really specifics.
Okay, you mentioned in your talk that you're not entirely convinced by Mike Parker Pearson's theory of the bluestones being where the pits are.
Yeah.
What evidence have you got to suggest that might not have been the case?
So the evidence that Mike has suggested supports the idea of bluestones in those pits is a layer of crushed chalk at the bottom of Aubrey Hole 7, which is the pit that was re-excavated in 2008, which was where in the 1920s the archaeologists had dumped all of the cremated bone from the whole of the site. So that's an Aubrey hole that has been excavated once in the 1920s and then again later in the 1920s to put all of the cremated bones back in, and then again in 2008. So to me, a layer of crushed chalk in the bottom of that pit doesn't really help us understand what that pit is being used for. I have a feeling that crushing might just be because people have been jumping in and out of that pit several times over the 20th century. There is more evidence if you look back at all of the sections and the drawings from the excavations in the 1920s. And there is some question. I certainly don't think that they were timber posts. I think that's quite clear that they're not the right size and shape to be timber post holes. But I wonder whether they were the bluestones. We don't have any direct evidence the bluestones definitely stood there. And to me, at the moment, a bit of crushed chalk at the bottom of a hole isn't quite enough to clinch it.
Very good. I'll ask a question put from the part of the country up in Yorkshire where I am. The question being, I can think of several reasons why more attention has been and still is paid to Stonehenge and the area rather than areas such as Thornborough. But why quite do you think that has been?
Oh, and yeah, in terms of archaeological investigation, I guess that's
indeed,
yeah,
other than the very obvious presence of the big stones.
Yes, yeah, well, that's part of it. I mean, Thornborough is crying out for a research project. It's a hugely exciting complex. Some excavation has taken place there in the past, particularly by Jan Harding. But the date, those henges, we don't actually know what date they are. So there's a big problem with Thornborough in talking about any of this in relation to other monuments or other complexes, is that we don't actually know the date of those henges yet. We desperately need to go and excavate them and find something we can date from them so that we can put them in the Neolithic somewhere, because at the moment they're really misunderstood and not well understood at all. I think part of it is, yes, the attraction of lovely big stones. Stonehenge is a place that never gets forgotten. It's not a place that has to be rediscovered later on in history. And places like Avebury and Stonehenge have got very obvious and very well preserved stones that, attract and intrigue visitors and antiquarians from the earliest days. Whereas sites like Thornborough, although there are still upstanding earthworks, are really not recognised as being significant monuments until much, much later on. So there isn't that such long history. Thornborough Henges, I don't know whether I'm supposed to say this, but anyway, it is, we hope, fingers crossed, coming into the state guardianship fairly soon. And we hope to be able to provide more public access to them and some interpretation on site, fingers crossed, if everything goes through properly. So I hope that more attention will be paid to Thornborough Henges over the next few decades.
Sounds promising. I live only a few miles from the Henges, so I'm very interested in that.
Good. Yeah. Ask me more questions at some point.
Another question, was there a Chalcolithic period? What's your view on this and how did it relate to the Beaker influx? Okay.
So was there a British Chalcolithic? Yeah, okay, so there's on the bookshelf behind me is a huge monograph published by the Prehistoric Society called Is There a British Chalcolithic? And in that, the experts put forward their answers as to that question. I would like, it's tricky to give a kind of 2-sentence answer to that. But yes, I think there is certainly, it's different depending on which region of Britain and Ireland you're talking about. It's probably the first thing to say. But there is certainly a kind of, I would say, a transition period when that kind of hashed area I had in my timeline between about 2500 and 2200, where you really got a complete overlap of things happening. And to me, defining that period, I don't know, having a 200-year, 300-year period as its own name, I suspect that's why we haven't actually defined it as a new and definite period before. On the continent, the Chalcolithic is much longer and much more easy to to identify. But yeah, I mean, I guess it would make things more helpful as an archaeologist. It's more helpful. That's I guess why me and somebody else at the National Trust had a disagreement about when the Bronze Age started, because it is this kind of overlap, flux, transition. It's not like everyone just wakes up one day and decides they're in the Bronze Age. There is this kind of transition period. So yeah, in some ways, calling it the Chalcalithic is helpful in that respect, but it is a period that is very much a transition between two other periods rather than its own thing. So I don't know what the answer is really. But...
Is there perhaps a need to move away from periods such as like that, the Bronze Age, the Stone Age, the Iron Age?
Yes, I mean, obviously those periods are very old-fashioned ways of defining by technology only. And every so often, lots of archaeologists have a debate about, what should we call it instead? And no one can ever come up with a better answer. The best way to do it is just to refer to years, really, in that our radiocarbon dating techniques now can get down to those 25 years of the Romans or whatever that Jeffrey was talking about earlier. So we are down to really specific dates. And so really the dates are the key thing, rather than kind of worrying about whether something is in the late Neolithic or the early Bronze Age.
I think that's hopefully a change that we can see now with the availability of radiocarbon dates, that we can start to go by years more than periods.
Yeah.
Just one last question that's in so far, going back to DNA.
Mm-hmm.
These Neolithic sites are likely to have been created by native populations,
mm-hmm.
but if the DNA from the burials tend to be from continental migrants who hadn't yet mixed with locals, then what do you think their link is to these sites?
Yeah, good question. So the earliest beaker burials do appear to congregate or cluster around some of these major Neolithic monuments and the monument complexes. So like the area around Stonehenge, like the area around Dorchester. So there's something about those places that is attracting people, and something about those places that means that they are a suitable place to bury the dead. Of course, they don't necessarily need to have been living there to be buried there. It's not necessarily the same thing. So yeah, to me, there's something that attracts the people who are in those first few generations to bury their dead near these major monument complexes that don't necessarily kind of belong to them. But I guess it's a bit like, I don't know, moving to Paris and being buried in a French church